Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Whiteboard Studio. I am your man out of Japan, Jay Contra, and an article came my way the other day, and I thought we'd dive a little bit into it, and then hopefully, through the power of this whiteboard, I'm going to try and illustrate to you the history of Japanese retro game collecting up until this point. And I want to attempt to solve a very prominent question within the collecting community. But I'm going to start out with the article's headline and just go from there. The tourists have taken everything, laments Japanese resident as retro runs dry. I don't bother shopping for retro games in big Japanese cities anymore. What I find very funny about this article being written in the year 2024 is that we have already seen this, like in an article printed 9 or 10 years ago in Wired, of all places. There was an article that I will read the headline to you now. Collectors are stripping Japan's rare game paradise bare. The classic gaming stores of Akihabara are being cleaned out by collectors, and prices are soaring. So we are in the year 2024. We've seen some crazy things happen, not just specifically over the last 4 years, but I think we can say over the last 15 years. So what I'm going to try and illustrate for you today is, how did we get here? How did Japanese game collecting become so popular that if you go to, say, Mandarake or Super Potato or Surugaya in Tokyo, that you're not going to find as many games as you did in the past? And the article that really inspired this video is specific to Kyoto, which is peculiar for its own specific reasons, which I might get into if I can remember it in this video. But what I want to show you is how Japanese game collecting has grown and expanded over the last 15 years. So first, the first kind of time that I've marked here is the year 2008. And, this is going to be a little bit fluid. The dates are just kind of there for reference. Up until like the late 2000s, in general, nobody cared about collecting video games of any kind. Nobody cares about retro games, which is a little ironic given that this was also the era when we had things like Animal Crossing introducing the NES games that were like basically a legitimate Nintendo emulator within Animal Crossing. This is also when we saw the very beginnings of game collecting, and it was mostly the very younger of Generation X as well as elder millennials. People born in, say, like, or people who had experienced the Atari in the 1970s and its waning years in the early 1980s, because there was, in the 2000s, because of eBay, a huge trade. I mean, well, huge is relative, nothing compared to what other retro gaming would become in the 2010s and the 2020s. But there was a big trade in Atari games. Atari games became very expensive and very sought after by folks who were essentially entering their later 20s and 30s and had disposable income in a decade that was known for being a little bit excessive before the 2007-2008 collapse. But you had a bunch of money sloshing around from people who had disposable incomes, who were collecting their childhood, and for them, their childhood was the Atari. But I think for folks of my generation, and I think even for a lot of that sort of elder millennial / younger Generation X, retro game collecting was still not a thing. It was very nascent. You had the Wii with the Virtual Console. You had Nintendo putting out all of those NES games on the Game Boy Advance, in addition to what they were doing with Animal Crossing. But this was where you started to see a swell of interest in retro games, but not necessarily a concurrent rise in retro game prices. It was still very easy to go out to swap meets, to go to flea markets, and find people just dumping their old video games because they didn't really care about them. Be it NES, Super Nintendo, N64, PlayStation. This is when I bought my first ever retro game. It was a copy of Super Mario RPG, and it cost $20. Now, that was an absurdly high price back in what would have been the mid 2000s. You probably could have gone to a swap meet and gotten it for like $3 or $4 for someone who was just trying to clear all of the junk out of their house. Interestingly enough, in Japan, you could still buy sealed copies of old games. What's very peculiar about the Japanese market is that Japanese producers of video games were still producing, for example, sealed copies of greatest hits PlayStation games. Some of the first retro games that I bought when I first landed in Japan in 2012 were new copies of Dragon Quest VII and Chrono Cross for the PlayStation. Now, these were printed in their millions in Japan, so even today, even sealed, they're not terribly rare, and loose, they go for like $1. But you could, in the early 2000s, you could go to Yodobashi Camera, you could go to Bit Camera, you could go to any one of the major electronics retailers, and you could buy sealed copies of like Famicom Disk System games. You could buy sealed copies of NES games, even though they're not technically sealed because NES, N64, Super Nintendo games weren't sold in sealed packages. There's just a note there. But in general, you could find new copies of games that today, if you slabbed them, would be, in the tens of thousands of dollars if they were graded highly. So the prices were low and games were abundant. You could go into Super Potato, which did exist at the time. You could go to Mandarake, which has been around forever. And you could go and you would see shelves overflowing with games. And at super absurdly cheap prices. Things that you would cry if you saw today. So because there was no demand, there was not a ton of interest in these games. And especially from a tourist perspective, really the only people going to Surugaya, I don't even know if they'd existed in the 2000s, but tourists going to Super Potato or to Mandarake, the only people going to these places, the only foreigners going to these places were generally, like game magazine writers who were in Tokyo for either Space World or for the Tokyo Game Show or for, they were visiting Japanese publishers to do a story. And they were the ones who were in the know because they probably heard about it from a friend who had been in Japan before. The other thing to remember about Japan, and this is Japan specific, in the 2000s is that also nobody is going to Japan. That's another huge factor because the tourism levels today, it's incomparable. In the 2000s, it was very rare for people to go to Japan. It was highly inaccessible because there wasn't a ton of English around. Japan was not really trying to attract a ton of tourists to go and travel around, and the internet was still gaining steam. There's no social media, there's no smartphones. I think it's really understated how, and I think this is really important, and that's why 2008 is one of those dividing lines, is because it's in 2007, 2008 when the iPhone comes out, when Androids are starting to, catch up in popularity. It's really those and the translation features that they have with the internet access that they provide that Japan starts to become accessible. And the result is that Japanese games also become accessible. So what is also happening in, say, what's the turn of 2008? I'd say the other big turn is YouTube in the form of, say, the angry video game nerd is starting to become popular. You're starting to see Let's Plays of all of these old games. In addition to the explosion of things like Instagram, which once you see these beautiful pictures of Japan and you realize that you can get there and it's not going to be a huge hassle to navigate your way around, that, Japan is no longer a scary place to go. It's not a place that people just go for business, which is largely what it was up until the 2010s. And that pivot point of the late 2000s and, say, early 2010s is huge and essentially completely changes the game to the point where you see from the year 2008 up until when that previous article that I was talking about, when you started to see those bare shelves in Akihabara, that's when the interest in Japanese games First, it's the interest in just retro games in general, expressed in the persona of the angry video game nerd. And the knock-on effect of that is people start looking at the Japanese games because they're the original games. If you want to play Castlevania in its unadulterated form, you're going to need to buy that Japanese copy. And guess what? That Japanese copy is, at least in this very fluid time of the early 2010s, is probably going to be cheaper than its American counterpart. And so I think you can semi-rightly, I don't think you should be blaming the tourists for anything, but I think you can pinpoint tourism as the real factor for the shelves going bare, for the loss of accessible Japanese video games, is really that era. Once the smartphone is introduced, once people start going to Japan in significant numbers, that's actually what's causing a lot of these availability issues of Japanese retro games, because it is tourists coming in. And that's where you also see like nascent channels like mine, Metal Jesus, and other channels that are explaining where you can go in Tokyo and beyond to where you can find all of these cheap Japanese retro games. The underbelly of all of this, and that I think is going to significantly increase in later years, is there is a small but growing online retail space for Japanese retro games. And that, I think, is often missed, because I think when we see these stories about people going to Japan and seeing the empty shelves, having a hard time finding games unless they go out to the countryside, that is a sort of superficial look at the overall Japanese retro gaming market. Because the thing is before the mid 2010s, and I think this is another important factor, is no Japanese eBay support. A huge thing that we need to keep in mind is that it was very difficult for Japanese sellers of retro games to access eBay. I don't think eBay had any Japanese language support. I think trying to get PayPal to work in Japan was a little bit complicated, but the only online retailers of Japanese retro games at that time were basically Mandarake. Mandarake has always had a very strong web presence, but the only games that Mandarake sells are the high-end and mintiest of the mint condition games. So that's not really affecting the stuff that you're seeing on store shelves in places like Hardoff or Surugaya. So really, in this era between 2008 and say like 2014, 2016, that's both increasing interest in retro games in general. That's where 2016, I think, is where you see the peak of NES games until the pandemic. But it was after 2016 that interest in NES really leveled off. Same goes for like Super Nintendo and 64. And then what happens is in the later 2010s, after say like 2015, what happens in the later 2010s is you start to see the online Japanese retailer explosion. Because what happens at the end of the 2010s? Surugaya opens up their web store and Surugaya.com opens. I can't remember if I'm leaving out a hyphen there or not. You see Japanese eBay support. You see Buyee. And I'm not exactly sure of the timing on this because I wasn't paying that much attention in the year 2020. But it was about this time, or at least by 2020, 2021, that you start to see a lot of domestic Japanese websites, sites that sell retro video games but were only accessible to Japanese people or residents of Japan. They start to make deals with Buyee, or Buyee figures out how to buy from these sites. And there's also other alternatives as well, like Zen Market. But what happens is you have these online distributors that are, they're selling everything. It's Pokemon cards, it's Gundam models, it's cute anime tchotchkes. They figure out a way, either by cutting deals or, using their web apps or whatever. They figure out how to funnel all of these Japanese games out of Japan to places abroad. And I think this is where I should say, I think a lot of emphasis is put on usually like North American and Europeans who are buying these games. But I think we need to remember, and this is something that I don't think has been fully explored, is I wouldn't be surprised if this is also around the time when you see a huge jump in, say, mainland Chinese interest in Japanese retro games. I have no proof of this. I'm just kind of assuming this is also going along with everything that I'm talking about because we have no idea. Because of the Great Firewall, and because of the language barrier, I believe, and from what I've seen in my trips to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and even in the time that I spent in China, I lived there for a year back in 2011, it was very difficult for mainland Chinese people to get a hold of these games. And this is also something that when we talk about tourism in Japan, because it's by the year 2020, until COVID hit, tourism to Japan increased 400% across the decade. That is insanely huge. So that means in by 2010, 2008, you see tourism increase 400%. And that's not just coming from North America and Europe. A lot of that is mainland China. And I would figure that along with all of that, because people in China, they knew about games. They love playing Nintendo games. I went to markets where they didn't have the original Japanese games, but they definitely had a lot of counterfeit games of things like, Final Fantasy, Mario. They had PlayStations. They had hacked PlayStation 3s that you could play all kinds of games on. They knew about this stuff, and once they gained access to these Japanese games, I think it's only natural that, same as everywhere else, they're going to want to buy them, because what is so peculiar about Japanese games and what differentiates them from all of their localized counterparts are these Japanese games are the originals. They are the source of everything. The original Mario, released in the 1980s, the year escapes me, 1985, that Japanese Mario is the first Mario. It's the original Super Mario. And it's the one that everyone is going to want. Because what's also peculiar about retro game collectors is that usually they want two kinds of a game. They want the one that they grew up with. So in my case, I want, say, Ocarina of Time. I want the North American release of Ocarina of Time, and I want the Japanese Ocarina of Time. Why do I want the North American one? Because that's the one I grew up with. It's the one that I can read in English, and that, is the one that's going to remind me of being 8 years old. And I want the Japanese one because that's the original one. That's the one where the American one comes from. And substitute me for, say, someone in the UK who wants the PAL version, someone in Taiwan who wants the Asian market version of Ocarina of Time. You want the one that you grew up with, or you want the one that was localized for your market, and you want the Japanese one. That's, I think, another pressure, that's another demand pressure on all of these Japanese video games. So you see eBay support come in by 2020. You see the rise of domestic sellers of Japanese video games. And there is so much stuff that goes on that we don't know about, that you just kind of hear whispers about. For example, I remember reading articles by this Japanese guy who I think he moved to Colorado, and he started a retro game store in Colorado. And where was he sourcing most of the stuff for his store? He would go back to Japan and he would fill up shipping containers with Japanese games, with Super Famicom systems that who knows where he was getting from. Like, there are all of these Japanese online websites. It wasn't just Surugaya, but there are these business conglomerates that basically will pay you to ship your old games. And remember, in Japan, they don't really have a lot of storage space for all this stuff. So when it's time to get rid of your Super Famicom because you're trying to move on, or it's just been sitting in a closet forever, and you go and you try to figure out, oh, you clack, 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 where am I supposed to sell all this stuff that's not going to be a huge hassle for me? You just ship it off to this company, and they'll pay you money for the stuff that was just taking up space in your closet. And those games have to go somewhere. Sometimes they go to a shelf on Surugaya, but more likely than not, it's being put onto online retailers like Yamatoku, which sells on eBay and sells. We're talking thousands of games, a month at least. And then all of this, and what's really interesting is that all of this comes to a halt in the year 2020 because COVID happens. COVID happens in the year 2020. And that's when I was there for the first couple of months of the pandemic. And that's when you saw stores packed to the brim. I remember going to Friends, to Surugaya, to Super Potato. I was seeing deals on games that just make me think, man, if only I knew what was going to happen. Because in those first couple of fluid months during COVID, when Japan was closed, Japan was closed shut. It was almost impossible. Even if you had a work visa to get in Japan, if you left Japan and you were a resident of Japan, you were not getting back in for the first few months. That's how crazy it was. Tourism grinds to a halt. There's essentially zero tourists coming in. And that's when you saw a lot of games on the shelves, because although there is the online Japanese retailer explosion in the last bit of the 2010s, for one, a lot of those retailers' accessibility to the outside world was cut off because Japan Post was not shipping things overseas due to COVID restrictions, due to labor shortages. But as things progressed, and actually, explosion is probably the wrong word for what was happening in the 2010s. I'd rather development, because the actual explosion is in 2021. Hold on, can you even see that? No. In 2021, as companies figure out how to sell given COVID restrictions, and in fact, to deal with COVID restrictions. For example, the biggest change I've ever seen in the way that Japanese retro games are sold is when Super Potato opened an eBay store. I never thought that would have happened. In fact, Super Potato had an online store where they sold games domestically, but it was only accessible for people living in Japan. And they even closed that store. It was almost like Super Potato was just giving up on online sales. But then COVID happens, and guess what? What is Super Potato's bread and butter? It's selling overpriced Japanese retro games to tourists. But then once that pool of people, once that customer base dried up because of COVID restrictions, they had to figure out, what do? Oh, we open up an eBay store. Because now eBay has Japanese support. Now, once Japan Post starts, allowing packages to be sent out of Japan, or they ship it through DHL, because it's a greater expense, but you could send things through FedEx and through UPS/DHL. And once Super Potato figures out how to do that, that's really, I think, where we can say that it's no longer tourists that are causing all of these shortages in Japanese retro video games. Because the reason the shelves aren't being stocked it's of course, yeah, there are going to, once the tourism comes back, because now that we're living in the year 2024, yeah, actually tourism is now at the point where it was before COVID. It's completely recovered and is actually going to get even worse. There's more tourists now going to Japan than there have ever been. And so, of course, yeah, they're going to want to go to all these retro video game stores, and they're just going to buy everything up. But the reason why there are even less games even getting onto those shelves in the first place are all of these online sales, be it through Buy.e, through regular domestic stores or Buy or Zen Market or whatever it is that you can do it through Yahoo Auctions, through people on eBay, because the eBay reselling market is huge. You have so many people just hitting up all of the hard offs in the middle of nowhere, buying up all of that supply, and then just selling it online. You have Surugaya. In that article that I was talking about previously, that was specific to the Surugaya in Kyoto, well, the reason Surugaya doesn't have much stock on its shelves anywhere in the country anymore is because of their online store and the free shipping. You have all of these games that are instead, they buy them up through their local stores or through people shipping them in through their online store domestically, that just get put into their warehouse in Shizuoka and then sold with free shipping through their online store, and they get sent out to who knows where. So when you think about it, yes, tourism is a huge part of it, but it's not the only thing. And I would dare say it's not even the thing that's causing all of these retro games to be so expensive and to be so hard to find. And a lot of people who have been in the game for a long time, I can say that I've been a serious retro game collector for the last 12 years now, having lived in Japan from 2012 to 2020. And yes, it is now, on the one hand, it's weird, because the thing is that it's not actually, if you use online sales smartly, it's not that much harder to find these games. They're certainly more expensive, but Japanese retro games, I've been saying this for the last, ever since COVID ended, since COVID really started, can we really say it's even ended? But since COVID, I've been saying Japanese games are now more accessible than ever. Up until that flashpoint of 2014, 2016, it was next to impossible to get a Japanese game unless you went to Japan. And so, okay, yeah, Japanese games are only accessible if you've got $4,000 laying around, so you can pay for your airplane ticket and pay for all the hotels that you need to stay in Japan to get these games. But then after 2016, and especially after COVID, now that you have all of these online retailers, it is now easier than ever. It's more expensive than ever, but it is simpler than ever to buy these Japanese video games. And just to get a little bit philosophical with you, because where I saw this original article posted, I saw all these complaints about, all the foreigners are killing the hobby. All these games are getting so expensive. It's so hard to buy video games now. I simply don't agree with that from a philosophical perspective, because you never have unlimited resources. Your time will always be limited. Your money will always be limited. Life is about making priorities. Collecting is about making your priorities. And I'll tell you, if you think ahead, if you plan, if you budget, you can still get a hold of the Japanese games that you want significantly cheaper than their American counterparts. Ocarina of Time Complete in Box is still way cheaper for the Japanese version than it is for the English version. And guess what? It's now easier in the year 2024 to get that Japanese copy than it was, say, 15 years ago. 15 years ago, okay, Ocarina of Time was like $3 complete. But guess what? You would have had to have gone to Japan to get it. So really, it becomes $4,003 to get that copy of Ocarina of Time. Now it's like what, $30 on Surugaya? Get it during the free shipping weekend. It's still going to be less than $30. Whereas the American version is like what, 200? Whereas what, the American version's like what, 150? Even the cartridge alone is like $50 for Ocarina of Time. Yeah, okay, so the rare games are getting super expensive. They're getting to the point where they're almost comparable to their American counterparts. You've got games like Contra, where the Japanese version is more expensive than the American version. Where Castlevania, because of the weird way that it was published, first it came out as a disc-based game, and then it came out as a cartridge version in 1993. So 3 years after the Super Nintendo, Konami decides to release Castlevania as a cartridge in Japan, whereas in America it was just a cartridge. And so therefore the Japanese version is significantly more expensive. Yeah, That's going to happen, but that's not every video game. It's a rare minority of Japanese retro games. And also, when you complain about other people buying this stuff up, when you think about it, existentially, what right do I even have to a game compared to someone else? Let's get into it a little bit. What right does someone living in Japan have to a game more than someone not living in Japan? You can make the argument that, yeah, that was the one released for their market. That game is meant for them. But guess what? Up until the mid 2010s, Japanese people didn't care about these games. You know how you know that? Because you go to Super Potato and you could buy a copy of, I don't know, like Pokemon for complete in box for $10. Because Japanese people also didn't care about these games. It wasn't until, like everyone else, that this interest in Japanese retro games increased. And the unfortunate thing about this hell world that we live in that is ruled by global capitalism is that how much you will pay for something essentially means how much you care about it. And specifically when it comes to collecting. When it comes to these luxury goods. Remember, collecting is a disease. Collecting doesn't make any sense. And because of that, because you don't need these retro games, means that how much you are willing to pay for something translates essentially to how much you care about that thing when it comes to collecting. Just like an eBay auction. You both, if it's say two people competing for the same item, the one who is willing to pay more for something essentially means how much more they care about it in dollar terms. It's awful. It's an awful system that we live in. And it is probably going to cause the destruction of us all. But when it comes to retro video games, we're talking about hunks of plastic with bits of metal in them. If you're going to complain about a 30-year-old piece of plastic that goes into another 30, 35-year-old hunk of plastic with some metal on it, I think we need to put that into perspective. Especially considering that buying Japanese games is still so much cheaper than its counterparts. Not just even within video game collecting, but of all kinds of collecting. Game collecting is still nothing compared to, say, high-end comic books or colonial furniture, where there are insane people out there who will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on an end table just because it was built in Connecticut in 1782. But if you're going to complain about how Ocarina of Time is $30 now, where it used to be $5 back in the day, I think we just need some perspective. Because yes, it feels bad. And especially if you've been in the game for a long time. You know how much cheaper games were and how much more plentiful they were 10 years ago. And even saying 10 years ago is insane, because in 2014, games were way more expensive then than they were in, say, the year 2004, where retailers couldn't give away unopened copies of The Legend of Zelda. Now, I'm talking the original one for the Famicom, which is, sealed is probably now, tens of thousands of dollars today. So what I'll always tell you, and I think even when I think about the next generation of collectors, I feel bad for them. I feel bad because they're not going to be like me when I would go to Kita Kyushu. I would go to the Manga Soko there, and I would take the train there. Oh, the shelves were lined with deals. I bought Getter Love for less than $20. It's a $400 game now. They had showcases full of rare variants of the GameCube. They had the Metal Gear Solid variant, the baseball variant, the Char variant. Those things are probably $500, $1,000 now, whereas I could have bought them for $100 if I was smart. And what I'll tell this new generation of game collectors is don't do what I did and just buy whatever. Have a plan, know what you want. Have a budget. Because if you know what your resources are available and you know what you want, you can correctly allocate your resources. You can prioritize the games that you want. And you can still buy them. They're all still accessible. They're all still affordable. Okay, maybe you have to spend some time and save up for Blastwind, because now it's $300. Maybe you're going to need to take a few months. Maybe you're going to need to work some overtime. Maybe you're going to need to maybe even not buy it. Like for me, I'm staring down the barrel of Castlevania Bloodlines, a vampire killer for the Mega Drive. I remember I could have bought it years ago for like $300. It's almost $1,000 now, depending on the website. Well, maybe more like $700-800. But I didn't prioritize it because I'm not a big fan of the Mega Drive. I was playing all of the other Castlevanias. But I'm gonna have to think: do I want it that much? Do I want it to the point of I don't buy other games? Or maybe I just don't buy it. Maybe the version I have on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection is good enough. Maybe once I end up buying a flash cart for the Mega Drive, maybe that'll be good enough. Maybe playing it on an emulator, that will be good enough. All of these games are accessible in one form or another. And to me, it's important to have the physical versions of the games that I care about. And that comes at a cost. In terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of effort. And so if you're out there collecting video games, yeah, games are more expensive than they've ever been. They're probably just going to keep going up in price, probably until we're all gone. And then in like the year 2100, no one's going to give a shit about the Famicom anymore. Maybe. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? So that went for way longer than I anticipated. I could talk for a long time about this kind of stuff. And I do, actually. Let's make it the transition. I stream at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every Sunday at twitch.tv/jcontra. Sometimes it's playing video games. Sometimes it's just yelling about video games like this. Sometimes I'll rant about movies every once in a while. A couple weeks after I post this video, I'd like to do a marathon stream where I play through all of my Famicom games. I'll post that up in the Discord, which if you've sat through all of this, you're probably going to be interested in joining the Discord, the Japanese Game Aficionados. I'll put a link in the description to this video. I hope to see you there. We always have great discussions. I and other people will complain about the price of retro games. We'll talk about all the scams we see going on, all the crazy shenanigans that Sudogai is getting up to. But again, a link to the Discord will be in the description of this video. Hope to see you there. I've been your man out of Japan, Jay Contra. Thanks for watching, and mahalo.